And yet you see this, St. Clement. Who are the two or three who gather in the name of Christ with the Lord in their midst? By three does he not mean husband, wife, and child? And I know not everyone here is raising children. Maybe you've already raised children. Maybe you're raising grandchildren or have grandchildren in your life. As an aside, when I was at Nashotah, study after study has shown the incredible influence a grandparent can have in the faith formation of their grandchildren, second only to their parents, especially if that child's parents have had to navigate parental divorce or addiction or emotional unhealth of various forms. Grandparents play a crucial role in that. And so whatever it may look like for you and me, we're all a part of a family. And if you can begin to view your family as a church, I think it's one of the most helpful ways to revive this idea of the daily office in a sustainable way for us. Let me tell you what that looks like for me and my family. Want a little window into my house? Oh, this is a good one. Just to say, this is a radical idea. Barna, who studies Christians, he does surveys of Christians 24/7. He said this: in a typical week, fewer than 10% of parents who regularly attend church with their kids read the Bible together, pray together other than at mealtimes, or participate in an act of service as a family unit. So this idea of viewing your family as a church is, according to Barna at least, a fairly radical idea. But I was going to show you this. This is my home. Living the last 3 years in the Greek Orthodox Church, they make a big deal and have taught the value of having a dedicated space of prayer in your home. And so we took that to heart and we built a prayer corner in our home. It's interesting because I've never had something like this before, and yet we put anything else on our walls, don't we? We've put photos of trips we've been on, or art that we find moving, books that are inspirational, and yet never have we had a dedicated place of prayer. And so one of the things we've done as a family is we've taken this to heart, and so we pray evening prayer virtually every night as a family with my wife and my children. We gather around this prayer corner, and we say the evening prayers of the church. And it's beautiful, and it's become a rhythm for us that reminds us that our family is fundamentally a church. And lest you think that is like an overly formal thing, like my children come to prayer looking like little English choristers with the sleeves, and it's a really domestic and homely thing. On Tuesday night, just this week, 2 of my 3 children came in memorable attire. My one son came with a Zippo, or Expo, that's what they're called, an Expo marker. He had drawn a big twirly mustache on his face and a goatee on his chin. My 14-year-old high school daughter came with onesie pajamas that looked like a cow, like cow onesie pajamas. And so this is how we gathered for prayer in our home. And yet they did so because we do it every night. And they expect this is what is done in our home every single night. And there's something about consistency that's infinitely more helpful than doing the whole kitchen sink, but doing it every 6 months. Doing 5 minutes of prayer. Pray a few prayers of the church, but do it every night, and it becomes something profoundly beautiful. If we can do this, I think of the Pope's words. He says this: families will manifest to all people the Savior's living presence in the world and the genuine nature of the church. Do I have 5 more minutes, or should I stop?
No, it's 5. Yeah.
5?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to tell you about one community. The Little Gidding community was a family that did this really well, and I'll stop here. The Little Gidding community in the 17th century, again, I love the 17th century Anglicans. This man was named Nicholas Farrar, and he, in about 1620, he was a rich, very affluent London man, and he and his family sold their home, moved to the countryside, and bought a house that had a chapel on the grounds. And they formed a community of prayer where they kept the daily office. It was focused on the daily office. And so they said that they weren't clergy. He was a deacon, but it wasn't a church. It was a lay community. They lived together. There were children, there were widows, about 30 people. And they prayed the hours, and they became so inspirational that in their day, George Herbert, the great poet, would come and visit. The king himself, King Charles, came and visited their community. You've probably heard of it from T.S. Eliot. He wrote a famous poem by the same name called Little Gidding. But I want to close with this. I'll show you this. You can still go to the church to this day. it was this very rigid community. They had this rule, this threefold rule that they observed, and yet the aim was always love. The aim was always restoration of communion, of relationship. And so when you entered the church, it didn't say, here's where you do your duty. Here's where you pray your prayers, and God likes you more. It says, this is none other but the house of God and the gate of heaven. So you walk into the church. This is the gate by which you encounter the living God. And then I'll close with this. If you go in the church, someone in a contemporary way has embroidered Farrar's final words, what he said on his deathbed. He said this: God will be worshiped in spirit and in truth, in body and in soul. He will have both inward love and fear, and outward reverence of body and gesture. This is the right, good old way you are in. Keep in it. And I love that because it's that twofold thing: inward love and outward reverence and bodily gesture. I have a whole list of practical resources, including Dwell, where I work, that I'd like to talk about. But maybe we do a Q&A first, and then I could speak to some of those if time allows. I know we have a hard stop. What do you think?
That sounds great.
Okay.
Quick hand before we move to the question and answer. I don't know if we really need this, but for the recording, I'll use it. Thank you, Tripp, for that. The thing that I think about in your argument for family home devotions is, I think one of the challenges we face this day is our competing schedules, right? We have so many things, and a lot of these things are good things, right? Like it's good that my son loves soccer, and it's good that my daughter loves gymnastics, and it's good that my wife has a job, and it's good that I have a job, and all these things are great. Thank God for them. But, you know, they compete with the consistency that you're pointing to is something that's really helpful. So what do we do about that conundrum? The fact that our lives seem sort of scattered, and how do we find that, or how, are there ways you've found that way to ground the family into some consistency? So maybe it's saying no to things, I don't know.
Well, that's what I was going to say. This is an unpopular thing to say, but we all have limited capacity. There's only so much time. That's true for adults, and it's true for kids. I'll never forget the shock on a parent's face when I told them their kid might have to miss a soccer game in order to come to catechesis. And they said, but they have a game. I said, well, but we have church. And therein lies the decision. There's a decision that has to be made that says, and I think it gets back to this idea of love. Like, what are the things you love? Because our loves are shaped by how we spend our time. And if the church is always, if time allows, if our life of prayer, if our life in the church is only, if I happen to be free, I'll make it, then I think there's a challenge there. There's it's revealing, I guess I would say. It reveals our priorities. Yeah. So sometimes it does mean you say no to things. Yeah. And it's hard because so many of Christian Smith talks about this. Christian Smith says this is especially difficult in an affluent culture. Because in an affluent culture, we make decisions for the good of our children that sets them up for a certain way of life. And he says one of the greatest challenges when it comes to faith formation is we struggle to see saying yes to a religious way of life or a prayer practice or whatever it may be. We struggle to see the economic benefit from that. And therefore, it's hard to prioritize it. So, yeah.
I have two more questions. That's good. Then I'm going to let other people talk. Sorry. How have you found, now you're doing Orthodox evening prayer. How have you found the balance of teaching kids, and we have the same struggle with, the 28 prayer book, teaching kids to sort of connect to, or the resistance that they might put towards doing something that seems harder than watching TV or something, there's things they would rather do, right, than say formal prayers with their parents in the prayer corner. But, on one hand, we don't want to, be these hard-edged, forceful parents. But on the other hand, we want to offer them the beauty of this structure. So how have you found, are there ways to, I guess some of it is just knowing your kids, right? But are there certain things, like how have you found that balance of like offering structure without being overbearing, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. My kids go to a classical school, and one of the tenets of classical education is you train kids in certain things when they're young, even if they don't know why or aren't ready to use it yet, so that it's there when they need it later. And I think that's part of our approach with prayer, which is I say to my kids, I know this is a hard thing to do. Because isn't that alone a spiritual statement of sorts? Like, I don't want to pray at 9 o'clock when we're all tired and just remembered we hadn't prayed. It's like, I want to go to bed or watch TV or whatever it is. But you're teaching by example. Like, we do things in life that have meaning and value even if we don't get immediate gain from them or pleasure from them because they're good and they're right. And so part of it is just trying to say, like, to our kids, this is what we do. Going to church is the same. It's not just the home daily office. I don't work as a priest anymore. And when I was a priest, I used to get very frustrated when people wouldn't come to church because I would think, I'm here, why aren't you here? And now I'm not paid to go to church. And I can tell you, I understand in a way I never have before, that like the people who were there every Sunday, I want to go call them up and say, like, that was an incredibly hard thing you did. Because it's easy to stay home. It's so easy to say, I'm not going to do the thing I know I should do. And so part of it is teaching the kids, like, you're learning a discipline. It's like when my kids say, why do I need to learn math? I'll never learn. I'll never use this. I'll say, no, you're right, you won't. But you'll use the discipline. You're learning to do a thing that's a hard thing to do. And that alone has benefit. That alone has value. Life with Christ is a lot more than math, thankfully. But yeah.
It's better payoff in the end.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Thank you. The other thing I was thinking about is I loved your distinction between cataclysmic remembrance and cultivated. But I was also thinking, like, we are going to have cataclysmic moments, like you mentioned, in our lives, right? And one of the beauties of a cultivated remembrance is that we know what to make of those cataclysmic moments, right? Like that, in some sense, it's not that it's either one or the other. We're going to need both if we're going to make sense of, and also maybe those cataclysmic moments can deepen our cultivated. There's a sort of relation there, maybe.
Yeah, I probably failed to emphasize that. There's a goodness in a cataclysmic moment. It can alert you to something really profound. When my heart stops beating how it should, it is a cataclysmic moment that says something's not right. You need to tend to this. You need to address it. And that's true in our spiritual lives. We have moments that say, wake up. Like, wake up, this is a big deal. You need to tend to it. But like you're saying, it's exactly right. It's not an either or, as though we ignore one to the extent of the other, or the expense of the other. Yeah.
Well, that's all I got. So what questions do you all have? Yes.
Well, it's not really a question. It was just something that occurred to me in the slide where you talk about vocation.
Yeah.
A couple of phrases down, like the second or third sentence. It wasn't these words that I'm about to say, but it made me think of the concept that we are God's hands and feet.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do, we are His hands and feet. And what my husband and I try to tell our children is that find something that you love to do and see how that is something where you're serving your fellow man.
Yeah.
And then that whole vocation and avocation, feeding one to the other, they say, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life.
Right,
But
right.
it is that thing, though, and I think that the formal church, the prayer book, the whole ball of wax, for example, that is St. John's, provides so many opportunities for this parishioner and that parishioner and that parishioner to be hands and feet, whether it's the bazaar or the outreach or coffee or whatever. So I think, in a sense, the hands and feet of what most everybody in this room does is that lattice.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
That's what I thought about. Not really a question.
I was driving down this morning, my brother-in-law called me, and he was having a Bible study tonight, talking about spiritual gifts. And he called me and he said, how do I know what my spiritual gifts are? And he said, I'm meeting with 5 or 6 guys, and I don't think any of us know what our gifts are. And I said, you'll never know your spiritual gifts apart from relationship, because they're not discerned without actual service, without actually being in relationship with another person. And so it's in the things we do with our hands and our feet that actually helps us know who we are, who God's made us to be. Because if I'm not in relationship, if I'm just in isolation, I get lost in my own pettiness. I get lost in my own self-absorbed thoughts. And it's when I talk with someone, when I interact, that I'm drawn out of that. and then actually know how to use my hands, how to use my feet, how to interact in the world. And so there's something beautiful about that. Like just the hands and feet are that. It's what makes us distinct, and it also is what shows us how we belong to one another.
And I
Yeah.
would say that discernment is the spiritual gift.
Absolutely.
That self-control is a fruit when the Holy Spirit is in your life. And it's that self-control, I think, that well-ordered mind
Yeah.
is what we're trying to teach our children through some of the things
Yep.
that you're doing.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
to talk so much, but I'll just say, when I was little, we didn't have the organ up in the back of the church.
Hmm.
And I can remember when I was in the second grade with that Book of Common Prayer, following along, and all of us all these kids were like up there in the choir loft thing, away from everybody, so we could misbehave and nobody knew it, or we could follow along, and we learned that.
Yep.
We learned that prayer book
Yep.
in that fashion.
Yep.
So it's that rote
Yeah.
thing, and then train them up in the way they should go when they don't get off.
Yeah. I was in church this morning, actually. Of course, thank you for having me. I was in church this morning, and there was a father in front of me, and he had a very distracted son, probably 8 or 9 years old, and they were standing, and the son just kept wanting to turn around and just kind of do this. And I want to say probably 100+ times, in the most gentle way, this dad would grab the son's head, and he would just go. He would turn him, and then he would tap him on the shoulder, and he would say, like, look ahead. But it wasn't harsh. There was such a gentleness to it. But it was for me a picture of parenthood, because he did it, and 2 seconds later the boy turns right back around. And he doesn't say like, oh, I guess he's not going to pay attention. He just kept redirecting him, kept turning him. And that's part of the work as well. That's part of this idea of a cultivated habit. It's like it's the repetition, and God meets us in that. There's grace in that to just keep turning ourselves and our children. It's that Augustinian idea, right? We're curved in on ourselves, and part of the work of grace is that outward turning. Yeah.
More questions?
How do you use technology? Can you use technology as a tool in family and beyond?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I work for a company called Dwell. Dwell makes an audio Bible app. And the hypothesis behind Dwell is that technology can be a redemptive force for good, which is interesting because technology is probably also the single greatest source of our inattentiveness, especially our phones. In the last hour we've been in here, I bet more than half this room has had a text in your pocket. Or you felt your phone buzz and wondered what that buzzing was about. Like there's always a tapping on the shoulder from technology that it makes it very hard to be attentive. And yet, the fact that it's with us 24/7 also has the potential to cultivate an awareness, like St. Paul says. This idea of praying without ceasing. Could technology help in some way? And that's part of what we're at least exploring, I would say, with Dwell. And so Dwell is a Bible app that really seeks to recover the art of listening. There's something different about listening to Scripture than simply reading it in a book, which is why, as an aside, when you're in church, you're not meant to pull out the Pew Bible and follow along when the gospel's being read. That's not a time to study. That's a time to listen. And so when the gospel is read, put the pew book down and listen to the gospel being read, because you receive it in a different way. You hear it differently. And so that's what Dwell is. And we've also now ventured in, like maybe put a toe in the water for some formative practices. And so we've put out roughly about a 5-minute daily office that's ecumenical, drawing from different Christian traditions. That's a way to try and not replace anything you currently do, but to say, what if it's a way to recenter throughout your day? The moment when maybe you'd pull out your phone and look at the news or TikTok or whatever else for 5 minutes, those kind of in-between moments of life. That's part of what Dwell is trying to do, is to say, what if you could reclaim those in-between moments to be a little moment of attentiveness, a little moment to say, I'm going to try and remember God in this moment. And so, I don't know. I think the verdict's out. I think a tool, like anything, has the potential for great good and also harm.
I
Yeah.
just envision my daughter with 4 kids in her Suburban.
Mm-hmm.
On the way to school, we're not going to listen to this station. We're going to listen to Dwell. There they are.
That'd be awesome. Yeah. We're actually recording.
Screen time is the
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't want to give a tech talk. There's a place for that. And I could tell you, we look at our phones 400 times a day. We spend a third of our day on a phone, on a screen in some way. Like there's some sobering stats. And so I think it's probably both and. Dwell is saying there are good uses of your phone, and we encourage you to find redemptive uses. Listen to scripture with your kids in the car, or as they're going to bed, whatever it may be. I also think it's learning to discipline ourselves and look at screens less. So it's probably a both and. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
More questions?
There seems to be a huge interest right now in the office, right? And oddly enough, you see, for instance, at certain Facebook sites I'll visit, and there'll be a picture of a computer screen, a Bible, a prayer book, a coffee mug, right?
Yep.
And that's sort of the shape in which we're going to do the office. And we do an online office here, and some parishioners are there live, but lots are tune in whenever they want to later in the day. So there's both this kind of, and there's there's a proliferation of books, office books, and
Yep.
so on. Some which seem to be somewhat superfluous, but they kind of represent the kind of people are drawn to it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And yet we have this this kind of office technology or technological office, which is going to become this very atomized
Mm-hmm.
kind of community.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, much what you're saying, a lot of this is we're going to find out what's possible here in this
Right.
new world. So what is it you think that is drawing people to the idea of office, even if the actual practice of it has to be this rather historically strange way of doing it without
Yeah.
unity of time or place?
Yeah. I can speak from my own experience because I didn't grow up with it. And I think I found I didn't know how to pray. And I didn't know what I should pray. And in the absence of that, I just didn't pray. And the office for me got me praying. Because even if these weren't original words to me, they were tested and true. And there was something that I could say yes to. And I think a lot of people, there's a restless hunger in every human soul that longs to encounter God. And I think the office proposes a way to say yes to that. It says, here's a way you can actually pray. And that alone for many people is enough to say, I want to at least try that out. I think increasingly in the next 10, 20 years, it will be harder and harder to know what it means to be human. I think it's one of the fundamental difficulties we'll face. What does it mean to be a human being? And what we encounter will be harder and harder to tell if it, in fact, is human. Dwell works in the audio space, and I can tell you right now about half the voices you hear online are a computer talking to you, and they sound an awful lot like a human. If Father Jameson would give me about 3 hours of his time, I could clone his voice and have him say anything he would want to say, and I promise you wouldn't know it's not him. And so these are the challenges of technology, is they make it harder and harder to know what's human and what's not, which is why incarnational face-to-face time is so essential, and partly why I would argue for the family, because when you're with whatever family is for you, when you are with other human beings on Sunday or on a Tuesday night when your kid's in a cow onesie, whatever it is, like that is a reminder of who we are fundamentally as humans, that we're incarnational, made in the image of God, flesh and bone that can be interacted with in that way. And so, again, I work in the digital space. I work in tech. I think there is a place for it, but I think we will have to be ever discerning about what place it should rightly hold in relation to this kind of interaction. Like what we're doing tonight is increasingly rare. It's increasingly hard to have these kinds of conversations, and we should have more of them. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, a digital version of this will be beamed up and turned into ones and zeros. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I didn't get into this just for the sake of time. I'll show you just briefly, just to give you a few ideas, and with the big caveat, and Father Jameson can help contextualize this, as well as your rector. because these are not 1928 prayer book specific, but just to show you, and maybe there's ways and others doing similar things. There are some resources out there where they have tried to create versions of the daily office that are tied to the prayers of the church that are still accessible in a home space. These first two are both 1979 prayer book resources, so forgive me for bringing these in. But the model is quite helpful, and someone should take a project to take the old prayer book and do something similar. The first is just a collection of prayers that are with the family in mind. So prayers for bedtime, prayers for school, that sort of thing. Ways to pray the prayers of the church at home. Hour by hour, as well as the second one, which was actually made by a man sitting in the back here who I used to work with in Texas, are kind of like a medieval throwback. In the sense, it's a way to say, it takes some of the guesswork out. These are simple books that help you pray the prayers. You just open it and it says Monday, here's Monday. It's not the whole thing. There's so much more you can do. But again, if you could pray these consistently for 5 minutes a day, you're building a habit that you can then grow on. The second one is the Pray Daily ones is based on the ACNA's prayer book, which is a little closer to the 1928. But then they also have one, and this one I think is really the star of that collection, the Pray Daily for Families, which is a beautifully illustrated daily office book that, especially for younger kids or if you have grandkids, like 5 to 10 range, it's the prayers of the church illustrated really beautifully. And these last two are more the what and the why behind this idea. So getting started with the daily office in the household is specific to, it's all in the name, this idea of praying specifically the daily office in a domestic context. And then similarly, living room liturgy does the same thing. I found a few from my Orthodox context now that are helpful. That the first one, Blueprints for the Little Church, is really beautiful. Lots of overlap with the Anglican tradition. It's a way of saying, like I was talking just a moment ago, it's a way of saying, here's how you can actually create a dedicated space in your home that is filled with ancient rhythms of prayer that work in our modern age. And it's even like nuts and bolts. Here's where you can create a little space where you could light candles or burn incense, whatever you would do as a family. The middle one is my favorite children's Bible that I've ever read, just as an aside. The best way to describe it is it's illustrated in like Byzantine watercolor. So if you've ever seen Byzantine iconography, it's very similar, and yet it's almost like they took watercolors and did them. So I wouldn't call them icons in the traditional sense, but very beautiful. My kids love it. They're captivated by this book. Even the older ones still read it. And then the right one is a children's prayer book, A Child's Guide to Prayer, which has, and this is why I mentioned it, has many of the ancient prayers of the church, East and West. So prayers of the saints, but they're simple and short enough that a child could learn them and study them themselves. And so, again, there's many more like this. Just a few ideas, ways that this has been revived, and then I already talked a bit about Dwell. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tripp. That was really a blast.
Yeah.
So a few quick reminders. Number one, if you have kids in youth group or childcare, 7 o'clock, they're kicked out to the curb, so go pick them up. So you have 15 minutes. But in those 15 minutes, I want you to eat as much food as you can from back here. There may be still some wine left, and then Tripp will be around. I'm sure you're happy to talk with people. And finally, Tripp has produced, for Dwell, the company he works for, an Advent devotional, and he's brought a bunch of them. I put them on the table right here on the exit, and they're free, right? Okay, so free for the taking, and written by him, so a trustworthy source. So do take one of those, and if you have a friend, take two and hand it to them. So I had a conversation with the guy at the post office the other day. He wanted a daily devotional, so I'm going to bring him one of these. But just a reminder, the next Sunday night session will be on the 12th, so I think that's 3 weeks from now. That's Melina Smith. Do sign up early, and thank you for joining us tonight. God bless, and eat and drink and be merry. Thank you.